There are truths that cannot be spoken without the very ground of the soul trembling. There are ideas that, once expressed, shake the foundations of everything we call faith. Imagine for a moment that the most sacred figure in history, the symbol of redemption, the mediator between the human and the divine, never existed. Not as a being, but as a construct. Not as a presence, but as a necessity. What if an entire civilization had built temples upon an empty name, an echo shaped by human hands, projecting onto the heavens what it feared to confront within itself? What would remain when the mist lifts and the voice we call Jesus reveals itself as the mere murmur of an ancestral desire for salvation? Spinoza would say that nothing is more dangerous than confusing faith with habit, because habit lulls to sleep while faith awakens. And perhaps for centuries, we have mistaken consolation for truth. Man, lost among dogmas and promises, preferred a tale that gently lulled him to sleep over a revelation that would make him wake in shock. But every lie, even a pious one, demands its tribute. And that tribute is consciousness itself, the forgetting of what is real replaced by devotion to a shadow. It is not difficult to understand why the idea of a non-existent Jesus seems blasphemous. The human heart needs faces to love, symbols to touch, stories to endure the absurdity of life. But what is more sacred? To believe in the image or to understand the principle it conceals? Perhaps the greatest heresy is precisely that, to dare to see beyond the form. For when the image falls, the invisible emerges. And that invisible, which neither kneels nor wears flesh, is the true God Spinoza sought to reveal. The one who does not save, but is. Who does not promise, but endures. The history we inherited was written by fear. Fear of the void, fear of autonomy, fear of the light that submits to no intermediary. A Christ was created to contain the abyss, but the abyss remained. Miracles were invented to fill the silence, but the silence remained. A glorious return was promised, a distant hope, and that was called faith. But what liberates more? Waiting for a return that will never come, or accepting that the divine never left? That heaven is not elsewhere, but pulses in the present moment, the only place where God can truly be found. If Jesus never existed, it is not love that dies, but the myth that dissolves. And in the void left by the idol, the substance reveals itself. The divine as totality, the soul as fragment, existence as temple. The truth, Spinoza whispers, is not the denial of God, but the unveiling of gods made in the image of fear. For where there is idolatry, there is domination. And where there is domination, freedom is crucified every day in the name of a salvation that never arrives. This revelation demands not faith, but courage. The courage to doubt, to lose balance, to bear the weight of an awakened consciousness. For truth does not console. It liberates even if freedom hurts. And when the veil falls, when the name dissolves, when the Messiah reveals himself as metaphor, man faces what he always feared, the responsibility of existing without intermediaries, of loving without promises, of living without return. Perhaps then, the true resurrection is not in an empty tomb, but in the spirit that refuses to be a prisoner of myth. The eternity we seek is not in a promised future, but in the moment when illusion breaks and being recognizes itself. Spinoza does not kill Jesus. He frees him from flesh, from time, and from religion. And in that gesture, he reveals what the centuries tried to silence. Salvation will not come from outside, for the Christ we awaited was always the forgotten name of awakened consciousness. There are names that were not created to reveal the truth, but to hide it beneath an acceptable face. The name Jesus has echoed for more than 2 millennia, and yet its origin remains shrouded in silence, as if it had been forged not by witnesses but by editors. No contemporary Roman inscription mentions him. No first-century historical document describes him. No administrative record confirms his execution. All we possess are echoes, late writings reconstructed decades later, in another language, in other lands, by men who never saw him. And yet faith turned echo into flesh, rumor into dogma, symbol into history. How can we not see that in doing so? Man did not find God, he built a mirror. The human spirit fears the void. That is why it creates stories. And the deeper the abyss of ignorance, the more intricate the tales invented to cover it. Spinoza already said, "Man imagines God according to his need, not according to his nature." Thus, the historical Christ is less a fact than a necessity. The need for a savior, a mediator between the finite and the infinite, between guilt and redemption. The problem is that when the mediator is fabricated, he becomes a prison. For whoever believes he needs an intermediary forgets that he is already a spark of the divine substance. The myth of the historical Jesus, in that sense, is the veil that prevents man from recognizing his own eternal spark. The first disciples, far from being eyewitnesses, were interpreters of visions. Paul of Tarsus, the most influential among them, never knew the man from Nazareth. His Christ was born from inner revelations, not real encounters. He is a cosmic being, not a terrestrial one. Symbolic, not biographical. It was Paul who gave body to the Christ, transforming a spiritual figure into a personal redeemer. And it was the church that nailed him to the cross, not as a man, but as an instrument of power. Thus, what we call Jesus is the convergence of Eastern myths, Jewish traditions, and Hellenistic philosophies, a mosaic of hopes cemented by fear. Historical records are merciless with pious illusions. Josephus, the Jewish chronicler often cited as proof, had his text altered centuries later when Christian scribes inserted paragraphs no Jew faithful to the Torah would have written. Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny all speak of Christians, not of Christ. They describe a movement, not a man. No line confirms the existence of the individual. All point to the formation of a myth. And yet modern man, hungry for stability, prefers comforting fiction to disturbing reality. Thus doubt is condemned and criticism is called heresy. But for Spinoza, heresy is merely another name for lucidity. For the one who doubts does not destroy faith, he purifies it. The true love of God is love for truth, not for tradition. And if truth demands that Jesus never existed, so be it. For the divine needs no biography, no flesh, no miracles to be real. What is eternal is not born nor dies, it simply is. And perhaps humanity's greatest error was to transform the immutable into a character and the infinite into a myth. For in trying to humanize the absolute, man ended up deifying the lie. Every faith that becomes power loses the right to call itself truth. When the Roman Empire embraced Christianity, it was not out of revelation but strategy. Constantine, the emperor who made the cross his banner, never sought a messiah. He sought unity. The empire was divided by uprisings, scattered beliefs, and fragmented identities. A universal symbol was needed, and the Christ, reconstructed from fragments of solar myths, Jewish prophecies, and Eastern philosophies, served as cement. Thus faith ceased to be a search and became a decree. The God who once dwelled in inner silence was enthroned in palaces. And when a God ascends the throne, man descends from himself. It was not a miracle, but a fusion. On one side, the imperial machine hungry for control. On the other, a malleable doctrine capable of adapting to every culture. It was in this marriage between the sword and the gospel that Christ was sealed as a person, not as a principle. The Council of Nicaea, far from being a spiritual act, was a tribunal of political reason. There, not only dogmas were decided, but also narratives. Who Christ was, what should be believed, what should be forgotten. Gospels were suppressed, texts reshaped, symbols purified. The plural was condemned as heresy, and the fabricated one became the only path to the divine. But imposed unity is the negation of truth. Spinoza knew it. Where there is coercion, there is no light, only shadow. An imposed God is nothing but the echo of tyranny. And yet man accepted it, because freedom is more frightening than servitude. It is easier to follow commandments than to look within oneself. Easier to believe in an external savior than to recognize oneself as part of the divine substance. The Christ of the empire offered cheap redemption. One only had to kneel. But the invisible price was the surrender of consciousness. The ancient gods, multiple and imperfect, reflected the complexity of the human being. The imperial Christ, pure and unreachable, reflected the need for control. Polytheism allowed the dialogue of forces, the acknowledgement of chaos, of nature, of the sacred feminine. Imperial monotheism eliminated that dance, transforming the cosmos into hierarchy. One God, one Son, one Church. The multiplicity of being was reduced to a single voice. And when only one voice remains, silence becomes suspect and doubt becomes sin. Thus, what had begun as a metaphor of union became an instrument of separation. The Christ who promised peace inaugurated centuries of war. In the name of love, libraries were burned. In the name of truth, philosophers were silenced. In the name of good, faces that did not fit the news story were erased. The cross ceased to be a symbol of compassion and became a banner of conquest. The God who preached humility was crowned in gold, and man, in his search for meaning, learned to fear his own reason. Spinoza would have called this a rationalized idolatry, when the spirit builds altars in which to imprison itself. If the historical Christ did not exist, then his Gospels are mirrors of man more than portraits of God. Each page, more than a testimony, is a confession, written decades after the supposed events, in different languages and for different audiences. The texts do not even agree on essential details, contradictory genealogies, births in different cities, words attributed to mouths that never spoke. How can truth fragment into versions? Spinoza would say, where there is contradiction, there is the hand of man. For the reason of God is one, and error is the mark of artifice. The Gospel of Mark, the oldest, ends abruptly. No resurrection, no glory, only frightened women fleeing the tomb. And so it remained for almost 2 centuries, until pious hands decided to fill the void. Matthew, writing for the Jews, adapted ancient prophecies to fit the new Messiah. Luke, writing for the Greeks, softened Christ, turning the rebellious prophet into a gentle sage. John the last speaks not of deeds but of the Logos, turning man into the eternal Word. Each gospel, therefore, is a mirror of intentions, a theological mask for different audiences. None speaks of a historical Jesus. All speak of an idea in conflict. The absence of direct testimonies is striking. No disciple wrote a single line. No Roman letter mentions the spectacle of a crucified God. No historian of the 1st century describes the earthquake, the eclipse, or the dead rising from their graves, phenomena that, if real, would have shaken the world. And yet the silence is absolute, as if the most extraordinary event in history had taken place in a vacuum, seen only through the eyes of faith. Spinoza would see in this not a mystery, but an allegory. Christ did not walk upon the waters of the sea, but upon the unconscious of man, a myth born of the thirst for transcendence. Later, theology tried to fill the gaps, stitch together the contradictions, erase the Gnostic Gospels, and transform symbolic parables into literal facts. But the more one tries to solidify the myth, the more it cracks. The Jesus of the Gospels is multiple, contradictory, paradoxical, at times a servant, at times a king, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, sometimes a fervent Jew, sometimes an enemy of the law. That multiplicity does not reveal a biography, but an archetype. It is the mirror of human impulses, the yearning for purity, the fear of the fall, the desire for redemption. Christ is the drama of the soul projected onto the cosmos, and it is here that heresy becomes liberation. For in recognizing the myth, we do not deny the sacred, we free it from its literal prison. The symbolic Christ demands no temples or dogmas, only awareness. He is not Lord of slaves, but reflection of awakened beings. Spinoza affirmed that the true worship of God is knowledge, and to know is to dismantle idols one by one, until only the substance remains. Thus the gospel ceases to be history and becomes metaphor, an invitation not to lift our eyes to heaven, but to look within ourselves, where the Word has always been flesh and where the divine has always dwelt. When truth cannot be proven, it is imposed. Thus was born institutional faith, not as revelation but as engineering. Faced with the absence of evidence, the Church did not retreat. It built authority. The silence of witnesses became divine mystery. The contradictions of the texts, spiritual inspiration. The lack of proof, evidence of faith. Doubt was turned into virtue and questioning into sin. Thus man learned not to understand but to kneel. What was myth became mandate. What was symbol became doctrine. And under the weight of obedience, reason was crucified alongside the invented Christ. Spinoza, persecuted by his own, saw there the cunning of power. When one cannot rule with light, one reigns with shadow. The Church did not need to prove me, it only needed to forbid. It burned texts, silenced thinkers, erased names from history. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum was not a list of heresies, but of mirrors. Each book it contained reflected the face of the symbolic Christ, the one that could not be shown without dissolving the priest's throne. For faith born of consciousness needs no intermediaries, and power that depends on ignorance fears awakening. The worship of the invisible became a machine. The invisible had to be turned into fear, and fear into currency. Thus were born indulgences, confessions, penances, mechanisms of control over the soul. Man was no longer the image of God, but his debtor. Every sin became a spiritual tax, every doubt a threat. The church keeper of the keys guarded heaven as property, and Christ, reduced to a symbol of guilt, became hostage to the economy of forgiveness. Love for the divine was replaced by terror of hell. Paradise turned into reward, and God harm into a creditor. For centuries, this edifice stood upon the submission of consciousness. Every heretic burned was a shattered mirror. Every excommunicated philosopher, a sealed breach. The fire of the pious did not illuminate, it blinded. For the light the church feared was not the devil's, but reason's. When Spinoza declared that God is nature itself, he returned the sacred to reality, and that was intolerable. A God without temples, without intermediaries, without hierarchies marked the end of the spiritual economy. And the end of economy is the end of empire. But no empire survives the truth, for what is built on fear collapses before consciousness. With every awakened soul, a stone falls from the wall. With every doubt, an altar cracks. The literal Christ needs armed defenders. The symbolic Christ does not. He lives in understanding, not in the sword. He lives in clarity, not in dogma. When man understands that the divine is not outside but within all things, temples become unnecessary. And the church, realizing this, turned love into obedience, for it knew that a free man does not kneel twice. Every belief is born of terror. Man contemplates the infinite and finds himself small. Death stalks him, chance defies him, time dissolves him. Unable to bear the silence of the cosmos, he pronounces a name, and that name, once spoken, becomes both refuge and prison. Thus was Jesus born, not as fact but as relief. A Father projected into the heavens, a Redeemer invented to save man from that which only consciousness can heal, the fear of existence. Spinoza said that man's ignorance is the cradle of superstition, and when thought bows before terror, myth rises as consolation. Humanity infantilizes the divine to endure it. It turns it into face, into flesh, into story. It needs miracles because it does not recognize the miracle of being alive. It needs a Messiah because it fears its own responsibility. Dogmatic faith is the most sophisticated form of escape ever invented, a way of delegating to heaven what is born on earth, of attributing to God's will what is merely the fruit of human cowardice. Thus, the literal Christ is the archetype of man who refuses to mature spiritually. He offers forgiveness, not awareness, redemption, not understanding. And the world, hungry for comfort, accepted this shortcut, even if the price was freedom itself. This psychology of servitude explains the persistence of the myth. Man prefers a comforting lie to a truth that demands courage. To believe is easier than to think. To kneel is simpler than to face oneself. The myth offers prefabricated answers, while reason offers mirrors. And mirrors do not caress, they confront. When Spinoza says that God is the cause of himself, he destroys the last refuge of dependence. For a God who neither punishes nor rewards cannot be manipulated. A God who does not speak with a human voice demands inner silence, and silence is unbearable to one who has learned to live off noise. Thus, the figure of Jesus became the alibi of consciousness. By accusing God of his pain, man absolves himself of his blindness. By awaiting salvation, he postpones awakening. The cross, symbol of sacrifice, became an excuse. He suffered for us, we say, to avoid suffering for ourselves. But the suffering that liberates is not physical, it is lucid. It is the moment when the soul realizes that nothing external can redeem what the inner self insists on numbing. The true hell is not fire, it is unconsciousness. And the true paradise is not the sky, it is clarity. Spinoza would understand man fears freedom because it weighs. To be free is to have no one to blame. It is to live without promise, without reward, without mediator. It is to love the real even when it does not console. The symbolic Christ, stripped of miracles and crowns, invites man to that courage. He did not come to die for us, but to die within us, in the part that still seeks masters, idols, and easy redemptions. When that Christ dissolves, the spirit awakens, and faith at last ceases to be escape and becomes vision. Man could not endure the silence of God, so he built religions to imitate it. Thus were temples born, monuments to the fear of being alone before the infinite. Every rite, every dogma, every learned prayer is an attempt to domesticate the indomitable, to reduce eternity to liturgy. But what is infinite fits no formula. What is eternal bows to no intermediary. In rejecting the inner God, Man created a spiritual theater, where faith is performed and the sacred administered. Spinoza would call this the idolatry of form, when the search for truth is replaced by the repetition of gesture. These institutions, born of despair, learn to imitate the fragrance of transcendence. They speak of light but cultivate shadows, preach liberation but promise rewards, proclaim love but raise hierarchies. Institutional religion does not heal fear, it refines it. It teaches man to fear elegantly, to doubt with guilt, to worship with dependence. It turned mystery into doctrine and experience into belief. And Christ, symbol of consciousness, was turned into the mascot of conformity. In every Mass, the mantra of renunciation is repeated, "I am not worthy." Thus, man is taught to kneel before his own reflection, without ever recognizing it. Spinoza saw in this a logical tragedy. The more man seeks God outside himself, the further he strays from him. For external search is a vicious circle. The more one builds, the more one loses. The more one prays, the more one forgets. Religion promises elevation, but chains with dogma. It offers heaven, but colonizes the mind. And by promising a personal God, it denies the divinity that inhabits all. Thus the believer is kept in spiritual childhood, obedient, anxious, awaiting a voice that will never come. Not because God does not speak, but because he speaks only in the silence that fear suffocates. These structures are sustained not by faith, but by need. They are the mirror of a world that fears inner freedom. For he who awakens needs no walls, no prophets, no crowns. The temple is the body, the altar, consciousness. When man understands this, the empire of dogma dissolves. For the commerce of faith exists only while there are customers of salvation. And the symbolic Christ, once recognized, destroys the market. For he offers no paradise, only presence, sells no promises, only lucidity. Institutional religion at its core is a misunderstood nostalgia for God. It is the echo of an ancestral memory, the lost unity. Man feels the call but interprets it as absence. And instead of diving into himself, he builds towers to reach him. But the divine does not dwell in the heights, it abides in the instant. Spinoza knew this. To seek God outside is like searching for the sun with a lantern. Here lies the paradox of literal faith. The more it illuminates the wrong path, the further it strays from the true light. And when man finally extinguishes the lamp of his beliefs, he discovers that the clarity was always there, in his closed eyes. The moment arrives when every illusion must die, not as punishment, but as birth. The image of the literal Christ, built upon centuries of fear and power, begins to crack like a hollow statue. Each crack is a confession. The crown of thorns falls, and beneath it there is no face, only a mirror. The name Jesus echoes in the void, and the void replies, "I am." The God we awaited never descended from the heavens because he never ascended there. He was here, in the breath that breathes, in the gaze that perceives, in the reason that understands. Spinoza whispers, all that is in God. And suddenly the abyss between the human and the divine disappears. Man is not a servant, he is an expression. He is not a sinner, he is a fragment. He is not exiled, he is substance, but freedom is a vertigo. When the historical Christ dies, man loses refuge and gains responsibility. There is no longer a cross upon which to project pain, nor a paradise in which to postpone awareness. What remains is the now naked, vast, inevitable, and in it, the sacred reveals its impersonal face, a God who does not promise but is, a God who does not intervene but embraces, a God who does not speak but manifests in all existence. This God needs no intercessors or temples, only minds daring enough to think and hearts capable of seeing. For to think is to pray, and to understand is to love. The dissolution of myth is also the rebirth of the soul. When childish faith yields, wisdom emerges. The symbolic Christ, stripped of history, becomes the living word, the consciousness that recognizes itself within the all. He will not return because he never left. The second coming is not an event, it is an awakening. Every being that remembers unity is a return. Every mind freed from dogma is a resurrection. The final judgment is not at the end of time, but in the instant man decides to see, and in seeing, understands that there was never damnation, only forgetfulness. The empire of belief trembles before this understanding, for there is no power over one who recognizes the absolute within himself. An awakened man does not kneel, does not fear, does not follow. He walks. And each conscious step is a silent prayer, a rupture with the ancient world. Spinoza knew it. True religion is the intellectual love of God, the serene recognition that all that is divine. In that love there is neither heaven nor hell, only clarity. Sin dissolves, guilt falls silent, fear bows. Christ, now freed from the name, walks again, but within, not without. Thus the cycle closes. The myth dies, but presence remains. And man at last understands that what he called faith was escape, and what he called heresy was awakening. There is no promised return because there was never departure. There is no Messiah, because the Spirit was always the messenger itself. And when the Spirit, weary of waiting for signs, chooses to look inward, it finds what was always there. Christ not as a person, but as consciousness. Not as a God, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, for the first time, man sees, and in seeing, remembers what he always knew. He never needed to be saved. There are truths that cannot be understood, they are felt, like the soft weight of something that has always been there, waiting for the moment of recognition. At the end of this journey, there are no dogmas to follow and no promises to await. Only the echo of what has been remembered remains. The Christ we sought in pages and on walls was nothing more than the reflection of a forgotten inner silence. When the myth dissolves, the spirit returns to its place of origin, not to heaven but to the center. The name fades, the image erases, and what remains is presence. Not the presence of a savior, but of being itself awakening to itself, like one who opens his eyes after centuries of sleep. All that has been said does not demand belief, but courage. The courage to stand before the void and still call it God. For where the face of the idol dissolves, truth breathes. Spinoza would say that to understand is the purest form of prayer, and that is what remains in the liberated spirit. Intelligence as temple, consciousness as altar. When faith is purified of hope, love ceases to be supplication and becomes substance. Then man perceives that there is neither fall nor redemption, only cycles of forgetting and remembrance. And every flash of lucidity is a resurrection. The myth that time once erected now dissolves into mist. The cross, once a symbol of guilt, becomes a bridge. On one side, fear. On the other, clarity. And as we cross it, we understand that the sacrifice was never of a man, but of ignorance. The blood that stains history is the price of consciousness insisting on being born in a world that prefers to sleep. Yet it is born. It is always born. For within us there is something that never yields, that insists on remembering, even when all voices command us to forget. And perhaps that is the true return, not of a Messiah, but of memory. The remembrance that we are made of the same substance as that which we seek, formed of the same light we implore, breathing the same breath we call divine. The God who never returned is the same who never left. He was only waiting for us to name what we have always been. When that happens, all distance disappears, and what was once faith becomes vision. From that moment on, the world is no longer the same, not because something has changed outside, but because the gaze has been purified within. The temple is empty, but the emptiness is full of meaning. The altar lies in ruins, yet upon its ashes freedom blooms. The symbolic Christ walks among us as a state of consciousness. He does not promise, he invites. He does not save, he reveals. He does not return, he awakens. And in the instant we understand this, time curves because eternity is not after, it is now. If something burns within you, it is not doubt, it is remembrance. Do you feel that restlessness? It is the beginning of rebirth. The world fears those who see. That is why it tries to silence open eyes. But one who has seen cannot unsee. Carry that uncomfortable light with you, even if it destroys everything you once called certainty. For this is how true faith begins. Not on your knees, but standing. Not in the shadow, but at the center of being. And if this awakening has touched you, do not let it die in silence. Let it resonate. Share it, spread it, sow it. Every gesture is a spark, and the fire of lucidity needs wind to stay alive. Subscribe not only to this channel, but to this path of clarity. For what is now awakening within you is greater than any dogma, deeper than any creed. Christ will not return because he never left. He was only waiting for you to open your eyes.